You think medieval executions were just savage chaos? Wrong. What England called justice in 1305 looks more like a legal ambush, a trial that may have been decided before it ever began, a punishment engineered to terrify, not to judge. This wasn't about one man breaking the law. It was about the state proving it owned the law. Every charge, every ritual, every step of the execution carried a message meant for you, watching, remembering, obeying. Records from inside the English system admit the process barely met even medieval legal standards. The body was broken, displayed, divided, each location chosen for political effect. Law wasn't suspended, it was weaponized. And here's the twist. Instead of crushing resistance, the spectacle may have exposed something dangerous. When justice turns into theater, legitimacy cracks. So what was this execution really designed to accomplish? Who benefited from calling terror law? And why are historians still uncovering contradictions 7 centuries later? Stay with me, because this case isn't just history, it's a blueprint. Comment your take, and subscribe if you want access to the next layer of this story. New scrutiny of medieval records suggests William Wallace's execution may have crossed even 13th century norms of brutality, forcing historians to reconsider the historical context of state-sanctioned violence. While the Middle Ages were undeniably harsh, the severity and calculated nature of the process applied to the Scottish knight is now seen less as typical justice and more as an intentional act designed to shatter the morale of a rebellious nation. The documented sequence of mutilation, torture, and display exceeded standard punishments for treason in many contemporary European courts, hinting at a strategic decision by the English crown to set a horrific precedent that would haunt the collective memory of Scotland for generations. What England called justice in 1305 is now being re-examined as a calculated act of political terror intended not merely to punish an individual but to neutralize a powerful symbol of resistance. To execute Wallace was one thing, but to subject him to the full agonizing ritual of being hanged, drawn, and quartered was to send an unmistakable message across the contested Anglo-Scottish border, signaling the total dominance of King Edward I. The cruelty served a functional purpose, utilizing fear as the primary mechanism of imperial control in an era when direct, rapid communication was impossible, ensuring the message spread far and wide through rumor and eyewitness accounts. Chroniclers close to the English court recorded Wallace's death, yet their accounts raise more questions than they answer, often glossing over the specifics of the trial while focusing intensely on the spectacle of the aftermath. These official narratives, such as those emanating from the court at Westminster, frequently minimize the legal and procedural deficiencies, instead framing the execution as a righteous act against an anarchic rebel who dared challenge the legitimate authority of Edward I, known as the Hammer of the Scots. The very precision and detail used to describe the dismemberment stand in stark contrast to the vague justifications for the initial sentence, suggesting a deliberate imbalance in what the court wanted posterity to remember. Historians now argue Wallace's trial barely met the legal standards of its own time, reflecting a process heavily skewed by political expediency and predetermined outcomes rather than genuine judicial inquiry. Even under the rudimentary legal frameworks of the early 14th century, defendants were typically afforded certain rights, yet records suggest Wallace was not allowed to speak in his own defense regarding the charge of treason, as the English crown had already stripped him of his status as a legitimate combatant. This blatant disregard for even the era's imperfect legal process transformed the court hearing at Westminster Hall into little more than a necessary step before the inevitable performance of punishment. The execution of William Wallace wasn't just punishment, it was performance, designed for mass psychological impact, a truth King Edward I utilized brilliantly to project his absolute power. This spectacle was carefully timed and situated in London to maximize visibility among merchants, travelers, and the general populace, turning the physical suffering of one man into a universal lesson for any who might consider opposing the English will. By making the violence public and excruciating, the crown sought to ensure that the image of the severed body superseded the memory of the inspiring rebel leader. Edward I didn't just eliminate a rebel, he staged a warning meant to echo across Britain, demonstrating that anyone who challenged his dominion would face the same horrific consequences. The king understood the power of visual terror. His strategy was to substitute governance through constant presence, with governance through recurring, unforgettable trauma. This act wasn't directed solely at the Scots. It was also a reminder to English nobles, Welsh nationalists, and Irish lords that the reach and ruthlessness of the throne knew no geographic bounds when faced with opposition. Documents from Westminster Hall suggest Wallace's fate was decided before the trial even began, indicating that the formal legal proceedings were a mere formality to lend state legitimacy to a political assassination. The records confirm that the judgment of treason, along with the sentence of the full punishment, appears to have been prepared in advance, essentially rendering the proceedings an indictment rather than a fair trial. This premeditation underscores the degree to which the English crown viewed Wallace not as a simple criminal, but as the central node of a national uprising that needed to be surgically and symbolically removed. Public executions in medieval London weren't spontaneous violence. They were carefully engineered state rituals, structured to reinforce the hierarchy and sanctity of the ruling monarch. These events followed a precise, choreographed order, often involving processions, proclamations, and the participation of state officials, ensuring that every element of the crowd's experience contributed to the sense of inescapable state authority. London's public spaces, such as Smithfield and the subsequent display on London Bridge, became stages where the political theology of divine kingship was brutally asserted over the body of the transgressor. Wallace's death followed a pattern seen elsewhere in Edward I's reign, rule through fear, where the suppression of dissent was considered a core function of stable governance. This consistent application of overwhelming force against political enemies, whether in Wales, Scotland, or against dissenting English barons, demonstrates a calculated strategy rather than accidental cruelty. By making examples out of key figures like Dafydd ap Gruffydd, the last native Prince of Wales executed just 2 decades prior, Edward established a cruel, yet predictable, method of maintaining centralized control over his diverse and often unwilling territories. The same ruler who expelled England's Jews in 1290 used execution as a tool of governance, revealing a monarch willing to employ systemic violence and social exclusion to consolidate power and fund his expansive wars. Edward I's reign was characterized by ruthless pragmatism. The Jewish expulsion was executed for financial and political gain, and the execution of Wallace served a similar, albeit territorial, political purpose. This pattern illustrates that King Edward viewed different populations through the lens of political utility, using terror, banishment, or death as interchangeable instruments to achieve strategic ends. Wallace's body was divided across cities, each location chosen for symbolic reasons, turning his posthumous remains into dispersed relics of state power rather than objects of grief. His limbs were dispatched to Newcastle, Berwick, Perth, and Stirling, cities strategically located near major centers of Scottish resistance or along key military routes. This calculated geographic distribution ensured the warning was delivered firsthand to the regions most likely to harbor rebellious sentiments, maximizing the reach and psychological impact of the brutal message across the contested land. Contemporary European observers quietly questioned England's methods after Wallace's execution, suggesting the brutality was noted beyond British shores, though few outright condemned the actions of a major European power. While the internal politics of medieval England were often brutal, the sheer spectacle and political intent behind Wallace's demise were disturbing enough to cause hushed commentary in courts like France, where similar political executions existed but were often managed with less spectacular public trauma. This diplomatic unease hinted at the potential damage to England's reputation among rival monarchs. Far from deterring rebellion, the spectacle may have hardened resistance in Scotland, transforming Wallace from a defeated general into a national martyr and a powerful rallying cry for future generations. The excessive cruelty ironically provided the burgeoning Scottish national identity with its most potent symbol of suffering and defiance, giving the subsequent campaigns of Robert the Bruce a moral clarity they previously lacked. Instead of ending the wars of independence, the execution ensured the struggle would continue, fueled by the memory of the gross injustice. Medieval law treated treason as a crime against the body politic, and Wallace's punishment made that literal, symbolizing the total disintegration of the rebels' ties to the crown and community. The process of hanging, drawing, and quartering was meticulously designed to destroy the physical integrity of the individual, mirroring the political act of fragmenting the state's unity. This judicial procedure served as a physical metaphor for treason, demonstrating through the visceral destruction of the body what happens to the nation when its authority is challenged. New analysis of the Lanarcost Chronicle reveals how propaganda shaped the official story, demonstrating that even contemporary accounts were often heavily biased by the political affiliations of the chroniclers. This English monastic text, though an invaluable primary source, frequently portrays Wallace as a villainous brigand and a lawless threat to civilization, serving to justify the extreme nature of his punishment to a contemporary audience. By stripping him of noble status and characterizing him purely as a traitor, the Chronicle cemented the narrative that the execution was necessary for peace and order. John of Fordoun's account challenges the idea that Wallace received anything resembling a fair hearing, instead suggesting the proceedings were a preordained political execution masked by judicial ceremony. Fordoun, writing a century later but drawing on earlier Scottish oral traditions and records, provides a narrative emphasizing Wallace's patriotism and the blatant disregard for law by the English court. His account underlines the perceived political corruption inherent in the trial, helping to solidify Wallace's image as a hero victimized by imperial tyranny. The psychology of the medieval crowd mattered, and Edward of Maes understood it well, crafting the execution to simultaneously inspire terror in enemies and confirm the righteousness of the crown to his subjects. The public gathering was a highly charged emotional environment, where fear could be easily manipulated and obedience forcefully reinforced. By involving civic officials and ensuring the highest possible visibility, the crown ensured the crowd became active participants in the reaffirmation of state power, effectively co-opting the populace into the narrative of justice. Hanging, drawing, and quartering wasn't random cruelty. Every step carried a political message, meticulously designed to dismantle the traitor's identity, both spiritual and physical. Being dragged symbolized ignominy, hanging signified rejection by God and man, disembowelment represented the exposure of internal malice, and quartering ensured no unified body remained for burial or veneration. This sequence was a theological and political statement that the rebel deserved total annihilation and had forfeited all rights to a cohesive identity. Wallace's head on London Bridge served a purpose beyond intimidation. It was state branding, a gruesome landmark that permanently etched the cost of defiance into the cityscape. London Bridge was the primary choke point and entryway into the capital, guaranteeing that every person entering the city was confronted by the physical consequence of treason. This macabre display turned the most public structure in England into a constant visual declaration of Edward I's ultimate authority. Scotland was labeled a rebellious province, not a nation, and that distinction justified extreme violence, removing any pretense of sovereign legal rights from the Scottish resistance. By treating Scotland as a domestic problem rather than a foreign war, Edward I legally enabled the use of punitive measures reserved for traitors against its population and leaders, bypassing international norms of conduct for prisoners of war. This subtle yet critical legal semantic maneuver paved the way for the brutality used against Wallace. What modern audiences saw in Braveheart was dramatic, but the historical reality may have been colder, suggesting a calculated, highly controlled event rather than an explosion of chaotic vengeance. While Hollywood focused on the emotional turmoil, the historical accounts indicate the execution was executed with disciplined, bureaucratic efficiency, reflecting the state's methodical approach to eliminating political threats. The cold precision of the state apparatus can often be more chilling than spontaneous fury. Hollywood softened the execution scene, but medieval sources describe something far more methodical, reinforcing the state's calculated intent to inflict suffering as a tool of policy. The descriptions of the drawing and disemboweling found in contemporary chronicles, though sanitized by time and translation, point to a highly technical process meant to prolong the agony and maximize the public spectacle. The reality was a bureaucratic act of torture, not just a savage release of rage. Wallace's death exposes how law can be weaponized during moments of political crisis, demonstrating that legal procedure can become an instrument of state power rather than a guarantor of justice. The manipulation of the treason laws, the swift sentencing, and the denial of defense illustrate a clear case where established legal frameworks were co-opted entirely to serve the political imperative of crushing a national rebellion. This remains an evergreen pattern in political conflict, where the letter of the law is used to execute extra-legal goals. Executions like Wallace's were meant to be remembered and feared long after the crowd dispersed, ensuring the threat of similar punishment became internalized within the populace. The deliberate extremity of the violence functioned as a long-term social control mechanism, making the very idea of rebellion seem so physically and psychologically costly that future acts of resistance would be severely curtailed. The memory of the spectacle, rather than the act itself, was the true deterrent. This wasn't medieval chaos, it was disciplined, symbolic state violence, demonstrating the sophisticated use of terror by the English crown to enforce its political will. The precision, the pre-planning, and the symbolic distribution of the body parts indicate a state capable of organizing and deploying violence in a highly controlled, messaging-focused manner. Far from uncontrolled brutality, the execution was a masterpiece of political communication through pain. Michel Foucault later described this exact kind of spectacle as power made visible, highlighting how the public execution serves as a dramatic demonstration of the sovereign's right over life and death. The 1305 execution aligns perfectly with Foucault's analysis of the public torture ritual, which was designed to reinstate the shattered image of the king's authority by making the state's ultimate power undeniably manifest on the body of the condemned. England's international reputation didn't emerge unscathed after Wallace's execution, even among allies, proving that excessive state cruelty always carries diplomatic costs. While the powerful Edward I could mostly ignore foreign censure, the sheer brutality contributed to an image of English ruthlessness and heavy-handedness in dealing with subordinate territories, complicating future alliances and diplomacy, particularly with France. Diplomatic silence from Europe may have spoken louder than protest, indicating a cautious international awareness of the brutality without formal intervention, common when dealing with powerful monarchs. Although no European power actively intervened or lodged a formal complaint against the execution methods, the notable absence of public endorsement or praise suggests a tacit disapproval and a recognition that England was operating outside typical norms of treatment for high-status political opponents. Wallace's execution reveals how authority survives by turning punishment into theater, using drama, public space, and fear to maintain a stable environment under duress. By ensuring the punishment was unforgettable, the state effectively outsourced its policing function to the collective memory of the citizens, making the threat of the sovereign pervasive, even in his absence. This theatrical approach to state violence sustained Edward's authority during a prolonged war for control over Scotland. This video is created for educational and historical purposes. It examines themes of power, corruption, and human conflict without depicting explicit or graphic events. 7 centuries later, historians are still uncovering what this execution was really meant to accomplish, understanding that the layers of political messaging, judicial manipulation, and psychological warfare are deep and complex. The primary goal was undoubtedly to end the rebellion, but the sustained terror and the creation of a powerful martyr suggest the execution achieved complex, contradictory, and enduring outcomes that shaped the subsequent course of both English and Scottish history.